Peace. This is Jamal Robinson with 720astrology.com. Today's date is January 25th, 2024. It is 12:47 p.m. Central Standard Time. Briefly, I want to discuss Pluto in Aquarius and the birth of capitalism. Pluto in Aquarius and the birth of capitalism. We're basically looking back to the 13th century and moving forward through the Pluto transits up until present 2024. So when we go back to the 13th century, I don't have the exact time, the date of Pluto's transit in Aquarius for the 13th century, but I kind of did process of deduction, determined it may have been around the 1270s when it made its ingress into Aquarius in the 13th century. Because Pluto has a cycle of around 245 to 48 years around the sun. So just about every 245, 248 years, it arrives back in Aquarius. However, I do have the date and year for its transit into Aquarius in the 16th century and its transit 18th century. And of course, now we are living present moment with Pluto making its re-ingress into Aquarius in the 21st century. 13th century, key things. We have the Benedictine monks are integral in introducing the schedule. Why is the schedule so important? One, for them, it provided a means to control their adherents, their monks. The monks had set times for when they rise, when they eat, when they study, when they worship, when they use the restroom. Everything was placed on a schedule. Now, why is this significant? It's significant because at this time, and we're going to say a couple of centuries before that, we still have an old world that is meshing with a so-called new world. And what is happening is man or humanity is systematically being divorced from nature. And one of the ways that man is connected with nature is through time being told and reflected through nature. I've referenced this book before, and I will again because it's just that significant. Time Wars. This is a must-have book by Jeremy Rifkin, Time Wars, because it gives insight into how systematically man has been more and more divorced from the connection to nature through being disconnected from nature's time cycles. And then the time component or cognizance pulled and extracted from the human and then placed into its own dimension. We are still living in the results of it, and we are reaching a crescendo moment that we can look back, especially to the 13th century, to kind of see its origin. So when these Benedictine, the order, produced this schedule, it naturally, because the Western world is driven by continuous progress, this linear thought about constantly moving down some imaginative line, trying to get to some imagined destination, it would naturally lead to the invention of the clock. Here's another great resource to give context to the world that this period would represent. Medieval times. And this book is called Medieval Callings by Jacques Le Goff. He's got other great, but he's actually got a book on time too that I plan to get. But Medieval Callings is basically showing what the world was like around this time, 13th, 14th centuries. And prior to the invention of the clock, the common man and woman were directed and driven. Their lives were governed by bells. And so, whereas it would eventually come to where you would have a huge clock in the center of town, a lot of times you go into cities and you'll see a huge obelisk, and sometimes it'll have a clock at the top, which is an energetic thing. But aside from that, these towns or cities, which would be walled off, and you would be privileged if you could live inside of the city walls and breathe the polluted air, just like we have now. This is nothing new. Inside the city walls was all types of degradation. It was just trash and pollutants, but you were close to the epicenter of things happening. So you did not want to be excommunicated from those city walls, because if you weren't in the city walls, you were in the wilderness. And the wilderness had no rules, no holes barred. And you're not only fighting the wilderness, you're fighting against whatever else is out there, animals, people, whatever. So you're fighting to be adjusted to something that's already messed up. Either way, this is before there are clocks. So in the center of the cities, you had bells, or what they would call a belfry tower. And when that bell would ring, it would direct the citizens or the inhabitants of the city as to what you're supposed to be doing at that time. And we see this has trickled down some 800 years, 900 years or so into the future, because, hey, we all went to school. And what were we conditioned by? The bell. Bell rings. Okay, class is over. Ooh, warning bell. You're about to be late. Another bell. You are officially late. Bells, bells, bells. Here we still are like little lab rats being controlled by bells. Well, the Benedictine monks would come along and introduce the mechanical clock, which would take the schedule and the belfry and raise it exponentially to another degree as far as control over humanity. You see, our bodies run on clocks. What's that? It's called the circadian rhythm. Our bodies are constantly running on an internal clock. So, and the most evident example is the woman who has the menstrual cycle, which the woman is a walking human natural clock. So we already have innate built in us the ability to tell time and to know where we are in time and space. We have a clock in here, and then we learned how to look up to the sky to see the clock above. As above, so below. As within, so without. And that was the original tethering and connection that man had with nature and the universe. The fact that he or she was involved in the workings of a greater clock. Again, what the operations of the 13th century began to sever the connection between man and the natural clock, which he was governed by. You also want to be aware that at this time, there is very low literacy in the world, which means there's very little, little access to information. And I just want to kind of harp on this for a second, the irony that at that time, literacy was low and you had to be part of some type of society or upper echelon of society in general to be privy to certain information. And a lot of the information was held by the Benedictine order that created the mechanized clock or the mechanical clock. The irony that now we, the vast majority of us, are walking around with a computer in our pocket, and that computer might be, at least easily $1,000 computer in our pockets. And most of us can at least read at a rudimentary level. And the majority of humanity will not read and will not strive to gain real information, real knowledge. Ironic. But the key thing to take away from the 13th century is that the seeds of capitalism were planted with the invention of the clock. And from an etymological standpoint, the word clock Guess what it means? Bell. Clock means bell. So the clock became an extension of what already was. And this is one of the other key things to keep in mind about Pluto transits in Aquarius. When Pluto moves from Capricorn to Aquarius, traditionally, it is still being received by Saturn because Saturn is the traditional ruler of Aquarius. So whereas Capricorn has been more of things established, traditional things, and the establishment, the long-standing power structure, Aquarius is more of future endeavors. So what can tend to happen with Pluto moving into Aquarius is that it may appear that an old structure is being torn down, when in essence what is happening is the old power structure is going through a form of alchemy. And we could even suggest that at certain levels, it is self-induced alchemy to continue its rulership and control. Isabel Hickey says in her book, Astrology, a Cosmic Science, she says Capricorn rules by force as opposed to Leo, which rules by right. And so that Capricornian nature of ruling by force may appear to dissipate as Pluto completes its transit in Capricorn and moves into Aquarius. But history shows that oftentimes it is a facade. It is the appearance of some type of change or some type of revolutionary spirit or the tearing down of old structures. But the danger is that Aquarius can be a very mechanistic energy, so that while the previous standing structure was flawed, it still had closer connection to some type of nature. And the danger is with Pluto moving in Aquarius is that this compel drive towards power and control can then be steered through an inhumane mechanism. In the 13th century, this inhumane mechanism is the clock, which changes the whole paradigm of the perception of time. We now move to the 16th century. 16th century, Pluto makes his ingress. I think it made its final ingress into Aquarius in 1532. So there are some things that we got to look at. The 16th century it's a hotbed of energy. 16th century. This is where we have the introduction of the Reformed Church, which basically, when we think of the Reformation, we think of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. We also think about the fact that King Henry VIII abducted from the Roman Catholic Church because he simply wanted a divorce. He wanted to make the rules work for his benefit. And when we think about Reformation, we think about the forming of the Anglican Church of England. I don't remember the exact name, but the Church of England. We think about, again, Martin Luther, but the real leader, we could say, of the Reformed Church movement would be John Calvin, and he was just the face of this movement. I can't remember there's another name. But Calvin became like the poster child of the Reformed Church, and that's how his name is associated with this movement. It's named after him, Calvinism. Two key things I want to say about Calvinism. It introduced the doctrine of predestination. That's key because, and this shows how it's still, although Pluto is beginning its transit into Aquarius in this century, it still shows how there's a concerted effort to hang on to what was. Because what begins with the invention of the clock and this emphasis on schedules and mechanistic time is that the powers that were looking to maintain the same feudalistic system that existed, but just to restructure how it looked or appeared. A new class is coming into the picture, especially around between the 13th and the 16th centuries. A new class is rising. The bourgeoisie, a neo-rich, We've got at that time what would be considered as new money, whereas resources were more so controlled by aristocracy and trickled down to their minions, who may be the lords, who would control the serfs and the peasants. With the invention of the clock and that period from then on, we have the emergence of a new class, a class that is now getting money, who have the ability to elevate themselves. And one of the ways they can elevate themselves is by creating industry. And industry is dependent upon efficiency. And efficiency is dependent upon set time. Now, those people who were peasants in the 13th century, in the 16th century, their lot has not changed. They have not risen any higher on the socioeconomic ladder. They just are reclassified. So when Calvinism introduces this doctrine of predestination, it supports serfdom. It supports peasantry because it has now connected these to a so-called God. And I say so-called because this is not divinely inspired. This is not. This is something that is born in the minds of men to justify greed and control and other psychological issues. So this doctrine of predestination says you are where you are because God declared this is where you're supposed to be. So therefore, if you're predestined to have somebody put their foot on your neck, then it would behoove me to go ahead and put my foot on your neck. I'm only doing God's work. God said you're the one who's down here, who's a serf, and you're nothing, and I didn't do it. This even kind of connects to the caste system in India. Okay, the other key thing that Calvinism introduced was the calling. And the calling connects to justifying predestination. So that if you were predetermined to be a nobody, nothing, stepped upon, well, do your best to be the best nobody you can be. So if we got you working 18 hours a day, then doggone it, do it to the best of your ability. Know that God called you to be laboring for our benefit. So the calling gave justification to whatever lot people were dealt in life. So you have one group that is aspiring for more power and control of resources, but they're also teaching the masses to accept where you are and to adopt this idea that you've been called to perform your best at the lowest rung of the ladder and be happy with staying there. As proof that Martin Luther was not the champion of society or of the common man and woman, you can go back and look at the peasant revolts of 1524, 1525. And this is about a decade before Pluto makes his ingress into Aquarius. The people are living in abject poverty, and so they revolt. They're tired. Our idea of poverty right now, we couldn't even relate to what that would have been in the 16th century. So they revolt. And you would think that Martin Luther, who is upset with the Catholic Church, one, because of the idea of donations, and not of like donations of people coming in on Sunday and paying tithes and offerings, or you going to your local Goodwill and donating clothes. This is about people being able to buy so-called God's favor. And so Martin Luther was a psychopath himself, but he was upset because he wasn't a member of the power structure. He was not a champion of the common people, because he turned his back and chastised the people who revolted against the controlling forces that made sure they stayed in abject poverty. So Martin Luther was not a crusader. He was a politician of sorts. During this same century, there is a master clock built, and this master clock would be the showpiece of European knowledge at that time, Western European knowledge. But this master clock, the master craftsmanship. Now, we got to also realize, for the sake of context, that we're talking about this is during the Renaissance. And we also have to realize that just a few years prior, exactly 40 years before Pluto makes its transit into Aquarius, the Moors are ousted from Spain. This is their last stronghold. And so they had been in Europe teaching for 700-800 years, which is how there was a Renaissance. The Renaissance, the rebirth out of the Dark Ages, was based on the knowledge that was acquired from the Moors. And so now at this time, there are certain people who are in more control of this knowledge, and they don't have the best interests of humanity at heart. They have set out to take this knowledge and to control everything with it. So that's the 16th century in a nutshell. 13th century, the clock emerges. 16th century, psychological programming, to where, again, it's tapping into how man utilizes his time. So as humanity becomes more disconnected from the natural processes of time, it also means that the three-dimensional, or the third three-dimensional world, is severed from the fourth dimension. Time is fourth dimensional. And so by separating, then time lords could then step in to control the three-dimensional world with greater ease. The Reformation represented a break from tradition. Pluto moved from Capricorn, which is tradition for one, and it moved into Aquarius. Aquarius, being the future, naturally can pose as a break from tradition. But again, we see the counter to that is by the same power structure that was in place, severing the connection from tradition, but not severing their control. This is done by further mechanizing society. Calvin's work, introducing predestination and the calling, the continuation of the usage of the clock, its further development, 1547, construction of the Strasbourg clock. And this master clock displayed the combined knowledge that had been acquired by the Western world until that point. These different occurrences or events would help give birth to Western capitalism, especially in England, France, and Holland. Now, 18th century, Pluto moves back into Aquarius around 1778. Now humanity must be mentally conditioned through education, religion, and the penal system. We've already had the reform that introduced Protestantism in the 16th century. Now the religion must be tethered into an educational system, because around the time of the fledgling United States system or government, there's a concern around what to do with children, because children are seen as integral parts and tools to be used to drive industry. This is considered to be the official beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Part one of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we've shown, though, that we can look back to the 13th century, but this thing has been unfolding in bits and pieces, steps, stages, layers. So by the time we get to the 18th century, we need an educational system that lines up with all of the work that's been done from an ecclesiastical standpoint. This is where industry and capitalism are building on the idea of you are where you are because you're just destined. And it's a form of veneration of God to do your absolute best based on the lot that you've been dealt. Don't aspire for anything more. And how does the education fit in? Because the children need to be educated just well enough to be able to go to work. So they need basic reading and arithmetic. And they're bringing in people from Europe to model or guide, as in how to set up this new educational system. What supports this is the nature of the economy. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, between the Pluto and Aquarius transit in 1532 and its transit 1778, the idea of the craftsman has been somewhat torn down. And because of the increase of industry, financially, it's not as feasible for one to continue running one's own business out of the home. Now the man must go to some sort of factory and work. As the price of goods and services increase, now the woman who was still at home and oftentimes attempting to educate the children, now the woman has to leave the home. So the next step is you'll find a woman in a community, and she would start what would be called dame schools. And then there's a further necessity to centralize the educational process. So they want to bring in outside consultants to help set up this new system of education, which again will support industry. Go and look for books, a series of books called Rollo Goes to Work, How to Be Industrious. I think it's Rollo, it's R-O-L-L, Rollo or Rollo. I think that's how you spell it. Rollo Goes to Work, How to Be Industrious. That's one of the books I've got, and it's just got to get it. It's interesting to read. The penal system is an attempt to be more civilized, because prior to this new emergence of a penal system, it was like going to see a movie or a matinee on Sunday, to go to the town square to watch someone be sacrificed, we'll say it that way, through different means. So there was an attempt made in the 18th century to be more civilized about how to deal with criminals. And that's how we get the prison system, gets its origin at this time. What do these three have in common? These three systems that emerged in the 18th century. It's about ways to condition human behavior. The educational system, the religious evolution, if you want to call it that, and the penal system. Ways to condition human behavior. So in the 18th century, man moves closer to becoming mechanized. 13th century, we have the clock and the schedule are in vogue. 16th century, we have a reformed religion, which then is helping to further condition the minds of humanity and to make them more mechanistic. Then the 18th century comes about, and we need the mechanized mind to help now drive labor, because human labor drives industry. And then we arrive to today, 2024. You walk in your local Walmart, and the majority of the checkout lines will be empty. No humans. There'll be a couple of cashiers, but the majority of people will go through the self-checkout line for different reasons. For me, I'll be honest, I've grown tiresome of attitudes when you go into stores. People who are getting paid to be there, but they're disgruntled and upset about their current lot, except they take out their disappointment on the customer. So to prevent having to deal with an attitude, a negative attitude, I'll often go through self-checkout, those rare occasions where I even go in Walmart. We see that Whole Foods, for example, has already given us clues or indications that it will eventually become the store where you'll walk in and there will be no cashier at all, and your phone will be your wallet, and or better yet, your human body may be your wallet. We don't even need an electronic device. It's already in you, and you pick up what you need and you go about your way. You've already been charged. The irony of what we have arrived at is 8 centuries ago, there was a concerted effort to control human nature because the human was seen as a physical resource. Where we have arrived now, the human's physical labor is no longer needed, which is very concerning. Now, the human essence is directly what is being targeted. And while everybody's kind of patting themselves on the back and saying the Aquarian age is here and the people are rising up, we should be sober and with our enthusiasm. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, is present the past to give context to the present. The biggest threat facing humanity now is humanity, because for 8 centuries, humanity has been conditioned to be inhumane. And while everybody's been fighting for trinkets and scrambling for nuts and like little squirrels, the bigger picture has been overshadowed by the desire for mere survival. And now we kind of arrive at a sort of end game that says we don't even need you anymore. The foundations of religious thinking are being destroyed. Whereas new foundations were being laid, they're now being destroyed. Everything's coming out now. Everybody's telling, it's like matter of fact, like All the dark secrets are being revealed. Why? One, to satisfy the karmic debt associated with any hindrance of free will. You have to tell so that you have not hindered people's free will to choose. Doesn't matter how you tell, you just got to tell. So the people must be made aware of all the ills that have persisted. The monad has moved closer to the core of the human, i.e. the soul. The human is no longer needed for physical labor. The human is just needed to be a battery. He or she will be given the trinkets that humans have been fighting for: attention, financial security, comfort, entertainment, full disclosure, all the secrets you want to know, here it is. What are you going to do with inclusion? Isn't that a key word right now? Inclusion. I want to be included. Fine. Everybody's included now. And humans want vice. They want vice. Attention, financial security, comfort, entertainment, full disclosure, inclusion, and vice. Now, some people may say, well, what's wrong with that, Jamal? Nothing. If there's nothing wrong with it for you, then there's nothing wrong with it. If by chance, though, you are under the assumption or gnosis that the purpose of incarnation is to evolve, then it might be a little troubling, because we may see that more and more, if you think in line with the latter, that you find yourself surrounded by more and more automatons who are perfectly happy to not have a soul and to become more mechanized, more robotic, less sentient, less feeling, less aware, less knowledgeable, less innocent, to finally have the trinkets that have been denied for the last 8 centuries. So, some things to think about. What world do you want to contribute to building? What do you value? What's your purpose? If those are some things that come to mind, then yeah, you're probably looking around and feeling a little troubled. But I want to read you something from the Gnostic scriptures from the book of Thomas. And it says, Jesus said, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will be troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all." Now, the all in Hermeticism, when we look at the 7 Hermetic principles, the first one is the mind is all and all is mental. And this text here says that when you seek and you find, what you find will leave you troubled. But the fact that you are seeking will actually elevate you, and you will eventually be ruler over the all. The all is this. So there's always a way. There's always a way. Hope is never lost. This is the way. 720astrology.com.